Well, welcome to this session on supporting eco-distress with Gabrielle Feather. It's lovely to have you here. Welcome to this session and this recording, which will be available just for a couple of weeks on Access for those that couldn't make it in person. Over to you, Gabrielle. Thank you.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. E tipu ake au ki Tamaki Makaurau, ko Lutuita, Tasmania, tōku kāinga noho. Ko Gabrielle Feather, tōku ingoa. Kia ora koutou. So, my name is Gabrielle. I am a Kiwi by birth and upbringing. I am currently living in Tasmania with my family, my husband and my two beautiful young daughters. I live on the side of this mountain that you can see in my background, and I'm doing my PhD at the University of Tasmania. It has been a 5-year endeavour, and I am in the final months now, just polishing chapters. And today I'm going to be presenting on the core of my research. There's sort of, I guess, the takeaways, the biggest things I've gotten out of it in terms of what we can use when supporting people who have what I'm calling eco-distress, but people also call it climate anxiety, eco-anxiety in other terms. So I'll start by sharing my slides.
Hang on.
Oh, I'll send a request to share. Thank you. And it might be nice for those of you who have been able to attend live to a couple of you are on your phone, so it might not be that easy to use the chat function, but maybe you could, if you can get onto the chat, maybe just say who you are and what brought you to this workshop. There is quite a small group, so we might be able to have a chat, but I'm also aware of time. So I want to get straight into it, and then if there is time, perhaps we can have a little bit more of a chat at some point. But if you just want to start by sharing in the chat what brought you here, and that might just give me a little bit of an idea of what to focus on. So my slides showing for everyone. Yeah. Great. Let's just move that around so I can see. I might just move straight into the second slide, which is about what I'm hoping that everyone will get out of today. So by the end of today's session, I'm hoping you'll have 4 things you can take back into your own life and your own work. So the first is a broader language than eco-anxiety. As I mentioned, I use the term eco-distress, and I'll be going into that a little bit more in the slides. The second thing is a way of holding the fact that distress can be appropriate. It can be in response to reality, and it can still need support. So even if distress is a reality attuned experience, there are still ways that we can be supported and that we can offer support. The third thing is for those who do work in a clinical way or have a counselling practice, there is a formulation map that I've developed. And for those who don't work in that space, this is still a way of perhaps making sense of what is going on for yourself, as well as for other people in your lives, and how to support them. And the fourth way is how to choose a first response that's based on the function of the distress as opposed to just the surface symptoms. So we'll be getting a bit more into that. And importantly, this isn't a treatment protocol or a diagnostic training. This is just really a framework. It's a way to pause and listen and then locate distress more accurately, more carefully. Um, and the reason that this is important is because eco distress is so vast, it's so layered, and it's so different for each individual. And what I've rather ambitiously attempted to capture in the formulation map is a whole range of configurations of this distress, and how it can show up for people. So as I mentioned, it's not the same for each individual person. It doesn't usually arrive as one neat presenting problem. And people are living inside of these interlocking pressures. So we've got climate disruption, we've got ecological loss, housing stress, health concerns, inequity issues, global conflicts, institutional failures, uncertainty about the future, and a real generalized existential distress. And that can lead to someone presenting with insomnia, irritability, avoidance, panic, guilt, despair, exhaustion. But these experiences may be connected to a much wider field of pressure. And if we can target that sooner, we can support these people more effectively. And that's why I find it helpful to think of eco distress as happening where the personal or the person meets the world or meets the ecological reality. So I often call this a person world formulation. And it's the world is not just background context, it's actually part of the presentation. And that's how it differs from more traditional models of distress that tend to background the context. I'm actually claiming that the context is the distress. And how can we work with that if that's the case? So this is why I use the term eco-distress or ecological distress, because eco-anxiety, while really useful and has created a shared language for us to use, it is much too narrow for what people describe. So as you can see on this slide, there's all sorts of things that people talk about. So anxiety is certainly part of the picture for many people, but it's also grief, it's also anger, guilt, helplessness, exhaustion, a heavy weight of responsibility, love, connection, hope, numbness, and changes in identity or what one can imagine is possible in the future. And often what people describe is not just at the emotional level, it can also be changed relationships, and that can be with other people, or it can be with the natural world, it can be with their family or their children, or their purpose, or their identity, or their sense of belonging, or their sense of security, their livelihood, or once again, the future that they're living into. So this term ecological distress just allows us to capture more of this, and it lets us ask what people are actually carrying rather than assuming that anxiety is this defining feature of this distress. And once we broaden that language, the next question we have is how to hold this appropriate distress alongside clinical or support needs. So as I've said from the top, one of the most important things to hold is that distress can be reality attuned and rational and still deeply painful and clinically significant. So it's not simply a question of, is this a normal response, or is this a maladaptive response or a pathological response? That frame is far too black and white. A person may be responding rationally to real ecological loss or threat or personal experience with a natural disaster or a climate related event, uncertainty, injustice, a real sense of injustice, a sense of moral strain. At the same time, they may be losing sleep, becoming isolated, feeling unsafe, feeling burnt out, and struggling at a functional level. Both of these things can be true, and so the task is to understand what kind of support is needed without trying to change or pathologize or ignore the reality of what's causing this suffering. And a common trap can be to assume that the distress itself is the problem or something that we need to reduce. And so one of the biggest shifts in working with eco-distress therapeutically is that we're not looking at reducing the distress. So sometimes, of course, the distress will need direct clinical attention, particularly if it is a risk factor for the individual. But we shouldn't rush to reduce it before we understand its function or what it's doing for the individual. So if someone is in contact with real loss or threat, it can be useful to know what it is that they're carrying and what more support or more connection or more flexibility or more sustainable forms of action might be able to enable for that person. So instead, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know whether you want me to chip in occasionally or not, but certainly this is in the conversations I've had, like in the counselling space, this is a really interesting point of tension between a really eco honouring kind of space where you're coming from and researching, and where some of our colleagues are at, which is, well, people just shouldn't be so stressed about this. You should just try and persuade them that it's not such a big issue, or, that kind of don't worry, be happy kind of thing. So, I really love what you're saying, that the distress is not always the problem and we shouldn't be necessarily trying to diminish or minimize it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. And yeah, you're more than welcome to jump in and just help contextualize this at any point that you feel appropriate. So, yeah, instead of asking how do we reduce this distress, we can ask, what is this distress doing in this person's world? And what I found in my research was that I kept coming back to this kind of formulation problem. So, if there's any of you attending today or watching later who don't work in the clinical space, when we talk about formulation, we're just talking about the sort of picture that we form when we're first working with someone about what's going on for them and how we can help, essentially. So this is just sort of a brief summary of the research I did in my PhD. So I did a survey of mental health practitioners. I did focus groups with people who were self-identified as having eco-anxiety. I did interviews, deeper interviews with experts in the field, so people who were not only practitioners or researchers, but people who were specifically working in this space. And then I synthesized my findings into this formulation map that, I found is more useful than one sort of intervention protocol. I did set out in the hopes of developing some kind of intervention, and in the end, I realized this is a massive web of interrelating factors that cannot be reduced in my sort of in my opinion, it can't be reduced to one intervention protocol. Rather, it's more important to understand the functions and the relationships that are going on for the individual, and then using existing therapeutic tools to support them. Yeah. So the simplest way to summarize this shift is this idea that eco distress is this person world phenomenon, right? So it's experienced by persons, that is bodies, emotions, sleep, attention, behavior, relationships, meaning, safety, but it's not produced inside persons, or it's not only produced inside them. It is shaped by ecological realities, systems, time, place, professional roles, family relationships, histories, identities, and future horizons. And if we individualize too much, we lose the world. If we only talk about systems, we may miss the suffering and the risk for the individual. So the useful place to work is at the interface between the person and the world. And before we move into the model, I just want to make clear how this differs from simply saying that the person is in context, which I have alluded to already. So an individual formulation might ask what symptoms, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are present for this individual. An individual and context formulation asks what external factors are influencing the person. But a person world formulation just takes it a little bit further and asks, how do relationships, capacities, ecological realities, time horizons, identities, and systems change the meaning and function of the distress itself? And that difference is important because the same outward or surface symptoms can point to different support needs once you start to dig a little deeper. And a useful way to make this distinction is to compare with a traditional common sort of case conceptualization, which is CBT. And we might be tempted to ask, well, is this just CBT with a climate context added? And it certainly could be. This CBT conceptualization is valid, but it's also not quite all of it. So in a CBT and context conceptualization, we might ask how context shapes thoughts, feelings, body responses, behaviors, avoidance, rumination, or coping. And some tools can absolutely still fit here. So some examples of tools that we might use from CBT when working with someone with eco-distress could include behavioral activation, so rebuilding routine, pacing and activity planning, especially with climate work and advocacy, or caring roles or news exposure when someone is getting burnt out. Pacing and activity planning can be really important. Even cognitive reappraisal can be useful. So for rigid and catastrophic or self-blaming interpretations of what's going on, but it has to be used really carefully so it doesn't become, think differently about the climate crisis, which Sylvia mentioned earlier, helpfully. And even exposure work can be useful. So gentle re-engagement with things that people might be avoiding, or conversations, actions, or information where avoiding might be costing livelihood or function. And certainly emotional regulation and grounding, so helping the person stay within capacity while feeling grief anger, fear, guilt, or overwhelm. And this is more of a sort of an ACT-based approach, acceptance and commitment therapy. And of course, with ACT as well, we have values-based actions. So choosing actions that protect meaning and integrity without turning action into an obligation to fix everything, which is really important. But in a person world formulation, we just take it a step further by asking what real world the distress is about and what the distress is doing in that relationship with the world. So we're mapping the climate reality, the person's values, their roles, their relationships, their place in the world, power dynamics, resources, and constraints. And some sorry, just give me a moment to collect my thoughts. So this is the formulating before intervening, right? And so some interventions that might stem from this person world formulation would be that would sort of go beyond a CBT approach are things like validation, so helping people feel less alone or overreactive about the climate crisis. Grief and meaning work, so really making space for loss, for experiencing grief, for guilt and uncertainty and changed futures, really holding space for that and allowing a client or an individual to move through that and really validating that. Capacity protection and acknowledgement as well. So a lot of people have very real capacity constraints, and these constraints can look like disability, they can look like caring responsibilities, they can look like sheer exhaustion and burnout, which was so rife in 2026, just the pace of everything. Everyone is so exhausted, trying to keep up with it all, trying to be responsible, good citizens in a world that is just so far out of our control at this point, which brings me to agency. So finding actions that are meaningful and sustainable without making the person responsible for fixing the crisis. And relate, yeah, Sylvia. You're muted.
Finish your track of thought. I was just going to, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just going to say this takes us into relationships and collective support. So actually moving people out of the therapy room and into community, and into spaces where peer support can be available, community, collective action, shared rituals, and organizational supports as well. And it's really important as well to just, from an ethical perspective, just notice where distress is being intensified by powerlessness and institutional betrayals and injustice or lack of support, rather than treating it as an individual coping problem, because it's not just about the individual getting better at coping or having more resilience. We actually have to really acknowledge the fact that they're inside of a system that is so far from what a human being needs to survive and thrive on our planet. And it's really hard. Yeah. Did you want to add your question or comment?
Yeah, I was just wondering perhaps whether we could, I mean, that was a lot of material, which is great. I love that. I love that emphasis that you have on this real world, like what real world is this distress about and what is it doing in our relationships and our, yeah, it's a very comprehensive, holistic model. I wonder, like, if we got time to do just a little role play or something, or just give us some examples of how that sounds and how that sounds differently in our conversations rather than just individualizing distress, right? We're
Yeah.
so used to individualizing distress.
Yeah. So
How
I've
do
got,
we expand it out?
yeah, totally. I've got a case example that I was going to work through with
Yeah,
everyone at about the halfway mark.
yeah, good.
The next few slides are going deeper on the model, so I'm hoping that that doesn't get
Yeah,
even more heady and cognitive for people, but hopefully it'll actually respond to what you're saying, Sylvia, and just
yeah, good.
give some real world examples of what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, yeah, it's good.
Okay.
Hmm.
So this is just a very simplified version of the model that I've been talking about. So it's got that those three circles um, embedded inside each other.
Hmm.
And what we're trying to do here is locate the distress before choosing the response. So what is the person responding to? How is that reality being lived in body, emotion, meaning, agency, relationship, and action? And then what conditions around the person make the pattern more costly, more sustainable, or more workable?
Hmm.
And the reason I use this model is that it keeps the person and the world in the same frame. So it helps us avoid making the person the whole problem while still taking their suffering and functioning and risk seriously. And then once we can see the configuration, we can ask what practical response fits. So I'm going to go through each layer one by one now, and hopefully they'll make a bit more sense. So the field of concern is that outer layer, and these are the larger realities, time horizons, identities, roles, and responsibilities that make the distress intelligible. The next one, the lived processes, is the central, most central circle, and that's how the person is carrying this distress in their mind, in their body, in their emotions, and in their agency and actions. And then this circle in the middle is what makes it, these are called them the modulating factors or the shaping conditions, and they are what makes the distress more or less acute or more sustainable or more isolating or more workable. So that includes things like relationships with others, relationships with community, relationships with the natural world. And then finally, at the end, we're looking at the function question here. So this is the bridge between formulation and support. And we're asking, what is the distress organizing or protecting or costing or making possible for the individual? And I'll have some more examples of that in a moment. So this is just going deeper layer by layer again. We've got the systems and institutions. We've got the time horizons of future and uncertainty, and we've got the identities and responsibilities that people are engaging in. In the center, we've got core processes, so sense making. So this is what the person is in touch with in their world. What news are they consuming? Where are they getting their information from? Are they a climate activist, or are they a like a climate scientist, someone who's got a lot of information, or are they simply consuming the information on social media? What's their emotional response or their emotional load? How do they see their agency? So, do they feel powerless, or do they feel like their actions matter? And then their engagement. What's their engagement doing? Are they withdrawing? Are they oscillating? Are they really, really engaged and burning out, or are they avoiding and not living in according to their values because perhaps it's gotten too much and they've pushed it all away? and the shaping conditions. So again, this is that middle layer, and these are relationships with others, whether they're getting validated in these relationships or whether they're getting isolated. So that means like, are the people around them in agreement about their assessment of the situation, or are they telling them that they are overreacting and they shouldn't be thinking about it, worrying about it?
Mhm.
Their capacity refers to, like I said, the real constraints that may be present in their lives that could be stopping them from engaging in what they hope to be. So this came up in my research with people who really wanted to be more engaged and couldn't because of real existing capacity constraints that they couldn't change. And then there's the relationship with the natural world, ecological encounters, and how these are showing up for individuals. So for some people, being out in nature can be really restorative. And for other people and in other times and moments, it can be distressing if someone is noticing a significant change in an environment that was once important to them or that is still important to them. So the natural world can both be a place of solace and a place of distress, depending how that's showing up. So the same surface presentations, as I've mentioned, can have different functions for different individuals. So if someone has, for example, sleep disruption, avoidance, and guilt, those signs might point to a risk or clinical significance or deterioration, but they might also point to capacity depletion, moral strain, agency collapse, or relational isolation. And the point isn't to choose the perfect one right away, but if we can get a little bit closer than we would without having this awareness or model, then it's going to create a more targeted support for that individual. And the point of this is that we can't infer the function of the distress from the appearance of the distress alone. And if we misread the function, our support might be well intentioned, but it could be badly matched. And we could spend a lot of time providing a lot of support that actually isn't what that individual needs. So, this is how we then use the model to start asking questions and guiding our formulation when we're working with an individual. So this slide is a simplified version of the model that you can actually use in a conversation. So the first one is what is in the field of that for that individual? What is this person responding to, and why does this response make sense? So that could include, their professional world, their, like I said, where are they getting their information from, and how are they making sense of that information? And this is important because it actually, when I was doing my research, I found that this was often the origin point for a lot of people, was where they were getting their information from and how they were making sense of it. And of course, there are so many different places we could be getting information, and that information is often contradictory, and it can be interpreted in different ways. And so that can be a really good place to start. And then the next question is, how is it showing up? So, how is that field being lived by the individual? How is it showing up in their emotions, in their body, in their thoughts, in their relationships, and in their functions like sleep or action, behaviors, and agency? And then the third question is to notice what's shaping the cost or sustainability of the pattern, or shaping the intensity of the pattern for the individual. What's making it heavier or more isolating or more workable or more supported. And that final question can help us choose a matched response. So if the distress is organizing attention around moral responsibility, then the first response may be, for example, validation and action in a constrained way. If it's costing sleep or safety, then the first response might be stabilization or risk management. If it's being intensified by isolation, then the first response might be connection in relationship. So this model isn't here to give us the perfect formulation. It's here to stop us from jumping to a generic intervention that might not be targeted or helpful. So we can try this on a shared case now, but why don't we maybe pause for a few minutes, and if anyone has any questions or comments before we move on to the case study, I can respond to those.
Just a practical question about what you're talking about, this kind of formulation and these kind of layers. Do you recommend writing it down, or do you recommend like working onto a whiteboard or something collaboratively? Have you seen some different models, or how do you envisage this looking in practice?
So how I actually envisage it looking in practice is that I will have a questionnaire that responds to each domain. But my research has not allowed me to take it that far yet. There are obviously many steps I have to go through to create a questionnaire like that and have it be evaluated and validated. So what I am recommending at the moment is personal note taking. I've got a handout that has a bit of a table just with the questions on the table, and it could absolutely be collaborative. Eventually, I do imagine it as being a model that could be shared with clients in the same way that we might share like a CBT model of depression or something like that, where it forms like a psychoeducation as well as a formulation. But yeah, the worksheet I'm going to share soon should hopefully help with that as well. I think,
yeah, I had a question and I guess a personal reaction to what you were saying, or personal, yeah. I think I would say that I guess my personal reaction to what you were talking about, and I guess generally the conversation around eco distress. I like that you talk about eco distress. Actually, I think climate anxiety is too narrow of a term to express what a lot of us are feeling about what's happening in the world. And so I love that term. I think, or rather, I would say for myself, the level of my eco distress, or the volume of my experience of eco distress for myself, is dependent upon the reaction of society at large to the reality of what we're facing. So when in New Zealand, for example, at the moment, you read about different political parties' reactions, or, their pre-election stuff. And when I hear the Labour Party, which I have hope towards, have had hope towards, talking stuff that is like, oh my God, what does he not get it about climate change? Does he not get it about my level of ego distress increases really fast? So I have not experienced ego distress as a personal, but rather as a collective thing. And in a way, when people also talk about systems, I have found this, but I'm not an intellectual in these things at the moment, but I found these issues a bit too intellectual for me. Like, to me, systems are made of humans. So I don't understand what is psychologically wrong with humans that are still part of systems that are destroying us. So the question, I guess, that comes from all of that reaction is, have you found, whether in your research or in your thoughts, that ecological distress, in order to be, I don't know what the goal is, alleviated? I don't know what the goal is, like comforted, regulated, I don't know, ought to be done on a one-to-one basis with clients, or is it better to be done in group settings? Because of what?
Yeah. So absolutely, I have found that this needs to be worked with collectively. And what I am hoping to encourage is creating for the professions, the counseling, the psychology professions, people who are working in those support spaces, is to help them feel confident and understanding what is happening for the individual when they come into the room. So I guess increasing like a competency to be able to see it, recognize it, work with it, but then ultimately guide that individual actually out into collective spaces. And I'm hoping that those collective spaces are going to continue to grow and be in existence, and that for a climate aware practitioner, they're going to be aware of these collective spaces that are available for them to refer their clients to. So I definitely don't think that this is something that can only be worked with one-on-one, but I think it is really important for therapists to be competent in this space, because more and more people are going to be coming to them and are already coming to them with this kind of distress and wanting support. And I think that support can exist alongside. So a client could have like a therapist alongside them for, a period of time, 3 months, 6 months, something like that. But that therapist also helps them to step out and engage in collective spaces.
And I guess, sorry to interrupt you, Gabrielle. I guess my question in particular is then, do you think that if for something like this, which is like an existential issue, eco distress is an existential collective issue. We have all caused the crisis together. We can heal it together. We will deal with the consequences together. Or maybe I should ask the question differently. Why would you not only have group therapy sessions, I guess, around that issue versus one-on-one? What would, I don't have the appropriate vocabulary, I'm sorry, but what would a one-on-one therapeutic relationship, how would a one-on-one therapeutic relationship help better than immediately you organizing group therapeutic from the beginning? If we're going to talk about this issue, we all need to work in group. I guess
it's a really good question. And yeah, I guess where I'm coming from is trying to upskill the people who are already working in a one-on-one capacity, so that when those clients do appear in their therapy room, they know what to do, and then they can then guide them out into collective spaces. And on a personal level, whether I'm ever part of creating those collective spaces, I don't know if I will be. But from the perspective of the PhD, I just had to start somewhere, and this is where I started. Yeah. Okay, hopefully a bit of a case example will help us to start to, because it has been so far really conceptual and theoretical, and this has been an ongoing struggle for me that I feel Athena alluded to, which is almost like, what is the end goal really? Because obviously the end goal is for people who are, like I'm sure we all are, uh, deeply connected to our embeddedness in the ecological reality that is our planet and our being as a humanity, as a creature that evolved on this earth and came from this earth. The ultimate goal would be some kind of beautiful, reciprocal, regenerative relationship with the earth. We are a ways from that, I think. If we ever do make our way to that place, it's probably still 100 years off, minimum. So what are we doing in the meantime? And yeah, I guess again to sort of speak to Athena's question, where we're starting here is with bringing awareness to the therapeutic space, allowing these issues to be in existence, because at the moment, what many people who I spoke to in my research told me was that they had brought up these issues in a therapeutic relationship and had been met with a kind of a stonewalling or a bit of a, like, that's not something I can speak to. That's not, and there's even been examples of people saying, the therapist was constantly trying to dig into my history or my beliefs or some trauma. And Athena, I think you actually illustrated beautifully the first step of the model, which is, what is the reality that this individual is engaging with? And you so beautifully illustrated that there can be nothing wrong in the individual, nothing that's sort of out of step with reality. It's simply, I am responding to what is happening over there outside of myself that I can see and experience with my eyes and my ears and my, cognitive processing, that there is a group of people who are in power who are not doing what they should be doing to lead us to this ultimate goal of some kind of sustainable, reciprocal, regenerative relationship with the earth. But let's just take it all the way back to this possibility that someone has presented. It could be, if you're not working clinically, this could be a friend. If you are, this could be a client. And I've got this case study of Morgan, who in this situation, I have allowed them to be either gender. I have said that Morgan is a parent. So you can picture Morgan as a mother or a father, or a different identity. Morgan is 42 and is an environmental professional. And they're presenting with exhaustion, irritability, poor sleep, isolation, moral strain, and a painful oscillation between information seeking and withdrawal. So that information seeking can look like doom scrolling, constant reading of climate reports, consuming the news, and then withdrawing for a time and not engaging with any of it. For Morgan, the distress feels personal, it's also professional, it's relational, it's ecological, and it's future oriented. As a parent, they're worrying about the future for their children. Nature used to be a place of restoration for Morgan, but now being in nature can intensify their grief. So just to reiterate the sort of the clinical signs that they're presenting with on the right here, and that's that exhaustion, that irritability. By moral strain, I mean the sort of experience of, sometimes we call it moral injury, and that's when someone is feeling sort of inadvertently caught up in a situation where their morals are being compromised and that's out of their control. So a lot of us feel this way, I think, about this, what's happening in the world. I've got isolation and relational mismatch. There was at one point a line on here that I seem to have removed about Morgan's partner not being sympathetic but not sharing in their concerns to the same degree. So that's where that isolation comes in. So this is where we would map on a piece of paper or on a table, something like this, these questions that we would be asking ourselves and asking Morgan. So the first step is mapping the field of concern. And for Morgan, this field includes obviously climate and ecological realities due to their professional knowledge. It also includes issues surrounding parenting and future uncertainty, systemic harms, and a sense of complicity, perhaps, due to their professional role. And these aren't just, you can see these aren't just contextual details, right? These are actually making the distress intelligible. They're making it make sense. So we're asking, what makes sense about this? And if we were only listening for symptoms, we might miss the world that Morgan is trying to live inside. This distress is located in a field. It's not simply an individual coping style, right? This is a constant interaction with Morgan's reality. So we're mapping the field. Where are they getting the information? What's that? What is that information? What's the quality of it? What's the intensity of it? And to an extent, how are they interpreting it? And how does this make sense for Morgan? And then the next thing we're going to do is then map the lived process of this. So how is this then lived by Morgan? So how does Morgan feel, perhaps? Does Morgan feel guilty or sad, or is Morgan grieving? How is Morgan's agency appraised? Does Morgan feel powerless, or does Morgan feel like they can make a difference with their actions? And again, is there engagement? So from the presentation, Morgan's engagement was oscillating, right? It was going from information seeking to withdrawal, from action to depletion and back again. And that first one, Morgan's trying to make sense of what they know professionally and what they fear personally. And that leads to the feelings. So as they're trying to make sense of it, that gets translated into grief or guilt or anger or vigilance or responsibility. And finally, this is the that central circle again of the shaping conditions. And this is where we can sort of start to investigate some of the things that are already helping or that could help if responded to. So who validates or isolates Morgan? So Morgan's partner is sympathetic but less concerned, which may still leave Morgan feeling alone. Their capacity is depleted by work and by parenting. And nature is no longer only restorative, it can also intensify grief. And this is where the formulation can really change the response. So if we simply told Morgan to spend more time in nature, for example, we might be offering something that used to help, but now doesn't. If we simply told them to take action, we might be adding pressure to an already depleted system. So now we're going to ask what changes when we formulate in this way. So formulation changes the first response. For Morgan, it would be incorrect to pathologize the fact that they are distressed by ecological harm. But it would also be unhelpful or unsafe to ignore those clinical symptoms, the poor sleep, the isolation, the depletion, and any risk if it emerged. And there are things that we shouldn't do too quickly. These are really important too. So these are things like reassuring them that everything's going to be okay, or demanding that they feel some kind of hope, or prescribing more action on top of an already depleted system, or to treat all withdrawal as avoidance. Because sometimes withdrawal in this situation is protective. It's necessary. Or again, to make distress reduction the only goal. So instead, we can respond with more precision, which brings us to function. So what is the function of the distress for Morgan? So function is like the hinge between the formulation that we've just done and then how we support them. So we can ask, does the distress organize? What does it protect? What does it cost? And what does it make possible? So the distress may organize attention towards something morally important. It might protect the person from numbness or complicity. And it may also cost sleep, relationships, capacity, and safety. So the distress is important. We don't want to take it away. It's telling Morgan, or it's telling the individual what's important to them. It's inspiring action. It's inspiring the way they choose to live their lives. It is telling them what their values are. But it's also costing something. And so different functions can point towards different first supports. So these are some first moves we can take. So this formulation is not supposed to be making things more complicated. It's supposed to help us choose the better first move. And sometimes the first move is to simply validate their reality. It's to say, it makes sense that this feels heavy. You are responding to real conditions. And sometimes the first move is to protect their capacity, to help them to reduce overload, to pace their engagement, to support them to rest and to sleep, and to create a sense of safety in their world, and a sense of replenishing that capacity. I think for a lot of people, I worked in climate spaces for many years before going into psychology, and there was a lot of over engagement without rest, without stopping, without the very placing low value in rest and restoration. And I think that that was over a decade ago now, and I think that that attitude has changed. I think that I have seen materials coming out of these sort of activist spaces that are much more right supportive of individuals taking time to rest and restore as a really important part of activism. But yes, certainly on an individual level, someone might be forgetting to do that. And sometimes that can be the first move, is to just encourage them to stop and rest for a while. And sometimes the first move is to restore that sense of agency, but not from a place of doing more, but to find actions or supports that actually fit that person's values and fits that person's identity or their roles or relationships, and then actual capacity, and having that be enough. So it's just like saying, what's the one thing you can do? As an example, for me, the one thing I can do is this PhD, which might sound like a big thing, but it fits in the broader context of my life. I'm not currently going to climate rallies. They're not within my capacity. They're not something that it's not a place that's supportive to me right now. In my early 20s, it was. It was a place that I found meaning and identity and energy and community. But right now, as a mother and a professional and an academic and a PhD student, that doesn't fit anymore for me. What fits for me is making an academic contribution and having that be enough. So for the individuals, what is the one thing they can do and have that be enough? Sometimes the first move is to change the field, or to ask whether a family, a workplace, or a community, or an institutional condition is making the distress harder than it needs to be. So maybe this person does need to change their work environment, change their job, or find a new community setting that they can be a part of that is supportive and generative for the individual. And the point is that not everyone needs all of these, but that the formulation should hopefully tell us where to begin. And because some responses can sound helpful but land badly, it's worth just naming again what to avoid doing too quickly. So I already mentioned these, but these missteps, they're often well-intentioned, but they can mislocate the distress. So if we reassure too quickly, this may invalidate reality before the person feels understood. If we prescribe more action, it may add pressure when capacity is already depleted. If we treat withdrawal as avoidance, it may miss grief, burnout, pacing, safety, or loss of agency. And if we assume that nature contact will always help, it may not be doing that in this case. And if we make individual coping responsible for carrying the entire climate crisis, then we're ignoring relationships and workplaces and communities and systems. Which brings us to an important boundary we need to be aware of, which is that this kind of support absolutely has limits. So this support does not replace risk care, trauma care, or systemic action. For example, if someone has been had trauma from like a climate event, if they've been involved in a climate event and have signs of PTSD, then treatment for PTSD should be priority. If someone is suicidal or unsafe in that respect, then we need to respond appropriately to that within our role and scope and pathways available. So the stance that I'm hoping that you'll take away from this is to formulate and locate the stress before trying to respond to it, asking what the distress is doing in this person's world, keeping the reality in the room. We do not need to imply that people have simply misunderstood the world or misread the situation in order to support them. We need to protect capacity because action without capacity can become another burden. And we need to choose what fits on an individual level because the same surface presentation can point to very different support needs. And the aim is not to make people feel fine about a world that is not fine. It's to help distress become more bearable, more connected, and more actionable. So that brings me to the end of my slides. I'm going to stop sharing. And so we've got about 15 minutes for questions and discussion before we finish up. And I did have a worksheet. I wasn't able to get it shareable, but I will send it out. I'll send it to Sylvia to share with you. And it's basically a summary of these slides with some spaces to take your own notes if you'd like to. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you about how this fits with the kind of conversations that you're having on, every day with people that you work with or connect with. It's such a fascinating question that Gabrielle's really focusing on is how we hold together the really personal, problems and the reasons that people seek help in their own personal lives and also these global realities. And I just really thank you, Gabrielle, and I honor the work that you're doing of just holding the reality of reality and acknowledging that that we can. It's actually really healthy to feel bad about bad things in the world, and that's not an individual emotional issue. It's not our fault. It's not my fault. So yeah, if anyone would like to offer some thoughts about how these kinds of conversations emerge into your world.
I have to say, you guys, that these conversations do not emerge in the world. Like, I know no one from my friends in New Zealand. I mean, I don't know that many people in Wellington. I've been here for 3 years, but generally where I've worked around people are not do not exhibit concern about any of these issues, which raises my distress. I have to say, Gabrielle, I love how you presented this, and also your explanation to my question in that, which I had not been aware of, that, uh, people in the therapeutic profession, I'm not sure exactly how to call it, but there's people that don't even allow for clients to address these issues. They don't know even how to respond. And so on that level, what you're doing is so critical. I mean, it's just opening this doors and windows of vocabulary, both actual vocabulary and also emotional vocabulary. I was invited to a dinner some while ago from some Wellingtonian friends of mine, I'd say my age, and one of the couples was from Nelson, and the woman is a therapist, and she actually got very angry with me when I said that the project that I was working on was the slow book bus, in order to have slow conversations with everyday people about how they feel. And she was like, why do we need to even talk about how they feel? Why do we even need to address this? Why do we need to scratch the wound? And she was angry, and she wouldn't let up. I was like, that's okay. That's sweet as, if that's what you don't feel like doing. But she was so obviously upset that she kept finding me in the room to kind of bring back the conversation she felt that by talking about these issues with clients or with people, that she was wounding, traumatizing people that were best left in ignorance, which I found fascinating, really. And on that level, what you're doing is awesome. Congratulations. And yeah, and good for you. And thank you.
Thank you, Athena. That's really kind and a fascinating example from your acquaintance there, because I've said it before in previous workshops that I think the feeling of it is paramount, and that to get to that collective response that you referred to earlier, we all have to be able to acknowledge it and feel it. And and for thousands of years in many different cultures across the world, expressions of grief were a part of everyday life. Certainly in Maori societies, it was a huge part of, and is a huge part of their culture. In Irish culture, is a huge part of their culture. Having ceremonies where grief was felt and expressed, it's paramount, and many people have started to speak about this collective response to the climate crisis as being a real first step, is to really feel and to be with others feeling, because until we feel, we're not going to be able to take the next right step. If we're constantly arrested in that, I've got to avoid the feeling, then we can't actually look at what's happening, because when we look at what's happening, it creates the feeling, and then we're just in avoidance, and we're just consuming and watching Netflix and buying new things and yeah, careening off the cliff. So that's a really interesting example. Thank you for being here and for engaging.
Jackie and the rest of you that work professionally in this space, is there almost that like kind of strange kind of warp that almost feels unethical in some ways, perhaps, to be talking about climate change, because it's not what we're trained for, it's out of our scope, it's potentially re-traumatizing. Like, is there any of those like an ethical kind of questions that we need to be dealing with as a profession?
Did you want me to respond to that, or were you asking the wider group, Sylvia? I mean, I can sort of, I would just really simply say to that it's something I think we're still working on as a profession, as what is our ethical role here. Yeah. And I certainly think if someone's bringing it themselves,
Mm.
then therapists need to be able to work with it. And that's what I'm hoping my work will help with, is giving therapists a way in or a way through, at least for a session or two, until they can perhaps guide them into a space where that can be more appropriately dealt with. Jackie, you've unmuted. What to do?
Yes. Well, I'm no longer working clinically. I've retired now from clinical practice, but I personally believe that it's unethical to not take account
Mm.
of what's happening in the world and how this impacts on our psyche. After all, we're not only part of nature, we are nature.
Mm.
You know, we can't separate ourselves from the natural world as much as we think we can and live as though we are separate. Um, so yes, I just wanted to say that I actually believe as professionals, practitioners in whatever field, that it's unethical not to take account of this. So not that we need to, it's unethical to bring it into the therapy room if people don't raise it, but if it's floating there, well, if it's actively raised, obviously, that's, we're going to be addressing it. But if it's floating there as a kind of underlying or overlaying realm in which, it's like the soup that we live in or the boiling water that's, the frogs in, slowly, the temperature slowly rising, and that we can find a way of just questioning, popping in an inquiry. Is this something that's impacting on you? And, people will respond and say yes or no. And it may be they're in denial and it's not where they need to be going in the therapy, but, maybe an inquiry might just open something up. Anyway, that's enough from me. It's a hobby horse of mine.
And I think it's certainly true that people are at different like levels and have different support needs. Levels isn't quite the word I wanted, but if you sort of think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think that eco-distress often doesn't have space to come in until some of those more basic needs are already met. So it is often considered like quite a middle class issue, or certainly eco-anxiety is. Having said that, there's so much research coming out now from, third world sort of countries, or countries where you may not think of as like white Western middle class communities, where there is absolutely a lot of what could be called eco-distress because there's more connection to the natural world. But yeah, I certainly think if someone's coming in because they've got a history of trauma that has nothing to do with the state of the world and it's not relevant to them, then it shouldn't be getting brought into the conversation. Yeah. But if it is relevant and they're bringing it up, or there's hints of it, then it's appropriate.
Gabrielle, thank you for all of that. I've just been thinking about, I work in a school as a counsellor, primarily, not totally, but mainly with young people. And I would say that there's not a lot of eco distress that comes that presents in my room.
Mm.
But so I'm here really, I was here really for myself because there's a lot of eco distress in my head, but not so much in my client load. But I work narrative trained, so sort of systemic post-structural therapies. And I just really like some of the questions, especially what would be irresponsible to pathologize, what would be irresponsible to ignore, what should we not do too quickly? I just think those are practice questions that I use all the time. And I think what one of my goals is setting up, the students, young people that I work with might not be presenting with eco-anxiety, but I have a sense that it's in their future. I have two young kids, one of whom is probably more concerned and aware than the other. And some of these questions that are used in other presenting issues can still start to scaffold, start to structure that idea that people, we are part of something bigger. That our distress, I really liked the idea of distress, not pathologizing the distress, that the distress makes sense when you look at the systems, the inequities, the pressures that come on a person. And so we juggle that with sort of personal responsibility, especially when a lot of clients come from the discipline pathway in a school. But even that, we can help them push back and go, well, you've taken responsibility for this action, but also you're part of this bigger system that you didn't choose, that has huge effects on you, on your family, on your friends, on your life outside of this system, on your aspirations. And so if we're laying the groundwork through this, and I really like that dynamic systems model. I like that idea of you're within this system, it's changeable, and you can have agency within it, if you start to explore those ideas. So I guess what I'm saying is I probably use a lot of the elements of this model and this approach, but now that I can see it really responding to eco anxiety, I think it really helps me hope that I'm preparing these individuals for when they do pop out and go, well, what are the bigger systems that I'm part of? Um, it's not going to be news to them that climate change is around. It's just that it might become more relevant to them as they go out as individuals beyond school. So not really a question, just I guess a response. And thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And yeah,
Fascinating.
To speak to that, it sort of highlights where I originated with the research and where I ended up. So I really came from a place of understanding all distress as realistic, as making sense, as responding to situations, to systems, to that we can almost always contextualize distress and understand it, which I think most counselors and practitioners understand instinctually. But how can we kind of embed this in our psychological models? And certainly where I ended up is with the dynamic systems model, is thinking, well, this could actually be relevant to many types of distress beyond eco distress or eco anxiety. And in that way, in my thesis, I've referred to eco anxiety as a kind of a stress test for psychology or for psychological frameworks that do tend to individualize distress when all individuals are deeply embedded in systems. So yeah, thanks for seeing that, and I hope it can be useful for you to take into your practice. Maybe just a bit of a framework to what it sounds like you're already doing. And I think instinctually most practitioners do know what they're doing, and often what we're doing in these building models and formulations is putting frameworks around what we already kind of know, what we already do, and translating them into models that can be shared and talked about.
Good. Well, on that note, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, and congratulations for getting to the end of, towards the end of the PhD. And thanks also to your partner and your kids and your mother. Thank you, Jackie, and all those, no doubt, that have supported you, Gabrielle, on this journey. And yeah, we're just excited to see where this goes next for you. I really hope for those professional spaces to open up for you from on both sides of the Tasman, to be equipping our profession and to resourcing our climate psychology conversations in on both sides of the Tasman. So many thanks. Thanks to all of you for joining in.